Hello and welcome to Pocket-Size Apologetics. I only needed these for the intro to know when that was done, audio, so I'm going to take them off now and put them where I can't even hear them so they don't distract me. The problem with that is that the audio on the headphones when I'm listening to it is slightly delayed from what I'm actually saying. So I hear both once into my voice and then once through the earbuds, and the earphones, and it just completely messes me up, and it gives me a headache as well. So I don't want to use those. So anyway, hey, whether you're watching us live, whether you're watching us delayed, welcome very much to episode 80 of Pocket-Size Apologetics. We are still in our quarantine mode, so to speak. And so for that reason, we are doing these live. Whether we're going to keep doing it this way after we're all back to quote-unquote normal, I don't know. Remains to be seen. Let me know what you think. But we're doing these episodes a little bit differently. For those of you that haven't tuned in the last few weeks or are all familiar with the show, it used to always be these little 3 to 4 minute, maybe 5 minute videos, on one particular topic, but it was pre-recorded, pre-uploaded, and that hasn't been feasible for a number of reasons since we've had to relocate, and so we've shifted focus here. Now we're doing these episodes as live YouTube streams here on Fridays at 12 noon on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel. You can interact. Please use the live chat. If you happen to be watching us live today and have any questions as we go through, use the live chat function, and I'll be more than happy to answer them as we go along. So, without further ado, what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about what's called the moral argument for the existence of God. Now, I don't think that it is an exaggeration to say that this apologetic argument for the existence of God is probably the most powerful for a lot of people, the one that they find to be most persuasive. Not to say that it's a magic pill and everybody's going to accept it. No, of course they're not. But there are a good amount of people who, if you were to ask them, well, if you did come to faith in Christ or came to accept the reality of God's existence at least through some kind of argument, apologetic argument, which one was it? This one's probably number one. It's in and of itself, the argument itself is not hard to understand per se, but there's a lot of levels to it, a lot of layers to it. And so we're going to take probably a few episodes to go over this, maybe at least 2, maybe 3, to go through all of the little intricacies of the moral argument. But today what I really want to do is I want to introduce it to you, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, and start to dig a little bit beneath some of the aspects of it. If you haven't heard the moral argument before, we'll get into more specific as far as formal premises, a conclusion, and all that in a minute. But essentially, in layman's terms, what the moral argument for the existence of God says is that morality, as we think of it, morality can't exist unless God exists. So because morality does exist, that means God must exist. So the only way that morality can even be a real thing is if God is there to give it meaning, essentially. And to kind of give you more of a sense for this, I'm going to use an illustration that I like to use in a lot of classes that I teach. Switch over here. I'm doing everything here today myself. So it's an illustration to show how the moral argument works and what it means to say that morality is objective. A lot of the themes that we're going to go through today. So here's the example I like to give. Imagine that our good old friend Steve is walking down the street one day and he's just whistling a happy tune. And then all of a sudden, from around the corner, this guy Joe just pops out, pow, punches Steve smack in the face. All right? Just out of the blue. No warning whatsoever. So obviously the first thing Steve says is, ow, right? And then he says, well, why the heck did you do that? And then they get into this big disagreement. And what always happens in our litigious society, Steve says, Joe, I'm going to sue you. All right? And I think, Joe, that I have the right to sue you, all right? And you did something legally wrong to me. If according to the civil law, it's kind of what we call our government laws, you did something wrong to me in that regard. And so I think that the civil law says that I can sue you and I can get monetary damages out of it, all right? Now, the question becomes, does it? Does it say that? And let's pretend that Joe, after Steve tells him this, Joe looks at Steve and says, no, I disagree with you. I don't think the civil law says that I did anything wrong, so I don't think you're going to sue me. I don't think you're going to get any money out of it. I don't think you're going to win that case. And then Joe says, well, I do think I can sue you. Steve says, no, I don't think you can sue me. Joe says, I can. Steve says, I can't. They go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The question is this. Is there any way for them to resolve their disagreement? Obviously, you've got two different opinions, all right? Steve thinks that he can sue Joe. Joe thinks Steve can't sue him. How do they resolve that disagreement? Well, fortunately, we have the civil law, right? You can go to a lawyer. You can, file the lawsuit, see what happens in court. You can open up a law book, all right? And you open up a law book, and sure enough, what does it say? In all likelihood, it's going to say, Joe, you shouldn't have punched Steve. Steve is allowed to sue you, and he's allowed to recover for whatever damages he sustained as a result of that. So what we have here is a situation where you have two differences of subjective opinion, and again, we'll talk more about what that means later, but you have Joe's opinion, you have Steve's opinion, they don't agree, but there is something above both of them that they're both subject to, whether they happen to agree with it or not. The civil law says what the civil law says, and if it says Steve's right, Joe's going to have to live with it. If it says Joe's right, Steve's going to have to live with it. It doesn't matter at that point what their personal opinions are. The civil law says what the civil law says, all right? Now, the question becomes, though, what if we were to extrapolate this situation to the moral law? Now let's pretend that after Joe punches Steve, all right, instead of Steve saying, hey, Joe, I think you did something legally wrong, Steve says to Joe, hey, Joe, I think you did something morally wrong. And Joe says, no, I think I was morally right. And Steve says, no, you're morally wrong. Joe says, no, you're morally right. Steve says, no, you're morally wrong. Whatever, I'm getting mixed up. They go back and forth and back and forth. The question becomes now, is there any way to resolve that dispute from a moral perspective, not a civil law or a governmental law perspective, but from a moral law perspective? Is there a moral law similar to that law book that transcends or is above both Joe and Steve that they're both subject to, regardless of what their personal opinions are? Now, keep in mind, it doesn't mean they have to know what that law, this question doesn't mean they're automatically going to know what that law says. For the purposes of what we're talking about right now, it doesn't even mean that they could know it. It's possible in our civil law example that neither Joe nor Steve may have access to that law book. They might not know what that law says. Who knows, maybe they're not even capable of understanding what the law says. But that doesn't change the fact that the law does, in fact, have an answer. All right? Same thing here with the moral argument. All right? Is there some moral law that is above us all that we're all subject to, regardless of what our personal opinions are? And of course, what the moral argument for the existence of God says is the answer to that question is yes. And that moral law comes from God. All right, God is the source of that moral law that is above us all, regardless of what our personal opinions may be. Now, if we were to take all of that and boil it down into a premises, a conclusion, a formal logical argument, it would look something like this. All right. Premise one: if a personal God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two: objective moral values and duties do exist. And conclusion: therefore, a personal God exists. Yeah, sorry for the typo. It says premise 3 on the slide there. It shouldn't. That should be a C instead of a P3. That's the conclusion of the argument. Therefore, a personal God exists. That's the gist. Now, what we're going to do is there's a lot of different elements here that we could look at. If you look at that formal argument, you might have a lot of questions running through your mind. Here's a few of them that might be popping up. Obviously, what are moral values and duties in the first place? What do those terms even mean? Why does it matter that God is personal? What does it mean for God to be personal, and why is that important? What does it mean for moral values to be objective? All right, and even if we know what that means for it to be objective, why can't morality be subjective? All right. How do we know that objective moral values and duties exist in the first place? How is it that moral values and duties are explained by God's existence? I mean, we say in there that that if objective morality is real, that God must be real. Well, why is that? How is it that God explains these things? And why is it that objective moral values and duties can't exist without God? Are there any other possibilities for some law above us that we could all be subject to morally other than God? Now, today what I'm going to do is we don't have time, obviously, to go through all these questions in one episode today. We are going to go through them, and we're going to tackle a few of them today, just to kind of start digging into it so you can get a better grasp of what the moral argument says and how it's justified. And then over the next few episodes, as I said, one, maybe 2 episodes in the future, maybe more. We'll see how it goes. We'll start exploring more of these in more detail. So the first thing I want to do today is just foundationally. I've used these terms, moral values and moral duties. And some of you may not know what the heck I'm even talking about. I mean, this is these types of things that philosophers like to talk about. And lots of times, if you're not engaged in studying philosophy on a regular basis, which let's face it, most of us aren't, you might not have even thought about this distinction. But there is a distinction when we're talking about morality between a value and a duty. Now, to illustrate the difference, first I'm going to talk about moral values. And let's see, cut there. So let me ask you a question to illustrate what a moral value is. What is the definition of goodness? All right. What does it mean for something to be good? If you were to come up with a Webster's dictionary definition, whatever. All right. What does that term mean, and where does it come from? All right. That's the question we'll get to in a minute. But what does goodness mean? However you define that term. All right. And we'll get into the definition, a Christian definition here in a little bit. But however you define that term, goodness. All right. That is what we mean by a moral value, all right? The definition, the defined term, that's the value. Goodness is a moral value, all right? But even if such a thing as goodness exists, all right, even if that we could define it and there's something real out there somewhere in the universe that gives foundation to this term goodness, why do we have to be good? Why are we under any obligation to do good things, to take good actions? I mean, if you were to say something is evil, does that mean just because there's something we could define the term evil, does that mean you're obligated to engage in evil actions? No, of course not. And that's raising, for those of you that are philosophically minded, I know that raises a whole different philosophical question about whether evil is its own thing. We're not going into that today. But that's my point. It's just because goodness, the value of goodness exists, it's a separate question of why we're obligated to live in accordance with that value. All right. So that's the difference between a moral value and a moral duty. Value is the definition, the quality itself. Duty is our obligation to mirror that, to mimic that, to act in that way. Why are we under that obligation? All right. So when we're talking about morality, we need to talk about where do both of these things come from. We have to consider both of them. Where do moral values come from? Where do moral duties come from? And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give you the Christian answer to that question as far as where moral values and moral duties come from. And this is another one I'm going to give you a little illustration to help you picture it. Let's pretend that someone was asked to describe you or me or any other person. And I don't mean physically as far as, hair color, eye color, all that. I mean, they're asked to describe what kind of person you are. What kind of things would you hope they say? I mean, you'd hope they would use terms like he's very loving, very kind, respectful, humble, all of these qualities of you that you hope you exemplify, all right? You certainly don't want people saying he's a rotten scoundrel, she's a rotten scoundrel, that person is dishonest, but what they're doing, no matter how they describe you, what they're listing off are character traits. Character attributes, all right? Because we all have a character, all right? We all have those types of traits that people can use to describe who we are on the inside, right? And hopefully we're all striving to have people describe us so they'd be describing us in positive ways with positive character traits. Well, every person has a character, all right? You have a character, I have a character, God also has a character. All right, we could describe character traits of God. God is loving, God is kind, God is just, all right? But there's a fundamental difference between our character and God's character, all right? Our character is far from perfect, all right? If anybody out there watching thinks that you have a perfect character, I hate to break it to you, but you're suffering under delusion. No, you don't, all right? None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. We all act out in ways that we shouldn't act out in from time to time. So if someone is describing our character and they were to be accurate about it, even if we're someone to say you're very humble, you're probably not humble all the time. I mean, they're speaking generally, maybe that as a general rule you're humble. This person is very slow to anger. Okay. Probably most of the time, but there's always exceptions to every positive attribute that we could use or other people could use to describe us. Not so with God, all right? When we say God is loving, that means he's perfectly loving. There are no exceptions, All right. There are no bad points, bad times when God falls down on the job and loses his temper unnecessarily, unjustly. All right. Whether you describe God as loving, whether he's just, whatever it may be, understand that we are describing a character trait in him, but he exemplifies that character trait perfectly. All right. That's what moral values are. Whether we realize it or not, when we say something is good or something is loving here on earth, what we're saying is that it is modeling, or it is resembling this character trait of God. Obviously not perfectly, because none of us are perfect, but God's character is what provides the perfect standard that gives those definitions meaning. The whole reason we can describe something as really being good is because there is a source of real, perfect goodness out there in the universe in God's character that we can be referring to. All right? So that's the Christian answer about where moral values come from. The question then becomes, well, what about duties? All right? Why do we have moral duties, and how can Christianity justify having moral duties? Well, surprise, surprise, I got another example for you. Let's pretend that you walk out the door, and while you're walking out the door, you're walking down the sidewalk, and there's a little tiny pebble on the sidewalk, and you kick that pebble into the neighboring flower bed. Have you done anything morally wrong to that pebble? No. All right. Let me change the example a little bit. Now you walk out, you're going down the sidewalk, and instead of kicking that pebble into the neighboring flower bed, you kick me into the neighboring flower bed. You kick a person into that flower bed. Now have you committed a moral wrong? Have you done something morally wrong? Yeah. What's the difference between those two examples? One was a person and one was a pebble, right? And that illustrates the moral point that we owe moral duties to persons, not objects, not things. All right? You don't owe a moral obligation to the rock. You do owe a moral obligation to me or to any other person out there. All right? So in order for moral duties to make sense, the source of those duties has to be a person to whom we are capable of owing duties. You see, duties are inherent in personal relationships. So if there really is some objective source, not just of moral values, but of moral duties, and I haven't defined that term yet, I should stop using it until I do, but what I mean, some source above us, all right? Just like in that example I gave with Joe and Steve. If there's some source that we're all subject to that not just imposes moral values, but also imposes moral duties, then that source has to be a person, because you can't owe duties to something that's not a person, all right? Of course, Christianity says there is a person that is above us, that transcends all of us, and that's God. And so Christianity says that we can find moral values, or moral values find their source in those character attributes of God. And we can also have moral duties because the ultimate source of morality is a person to whom we are capable of owing a duty. And duties are inherent in personal relationships. So that's the difference between moral values and moral duties. What I want to do next is define a couple other terms that I've been using, that I'm using sometimes even before I define them, which I should be careful not to do. And that is the difference between objective morality and subjective morality. What does it mean for morality to be objective versus subjective? And for this, I'm going to ask you to think back to our example at the beginning here of Joe and Steve. All right? With the example of Joe and Steve, they had a disagreement as far as whether or not something was morally right or whether something was morally wrong. All right? Objective morality. If a morality is what we call objective, it means there is some moral law, like that civil law, that both Joe and Steve are subject to, whether or not they personally agree with it or not. In other words, there's something about the act itself of Joe punching Steve, all right, the object, all right, that defines whether or not it was morally right or morally wrong. All right. So if there is something above them that they're both subject to, some moral law they're both subject to, whether they agree with it or not, that's an example of an objective moral law. Now, a subjective morality would mean there is no law above them. That there is nothing above them whatsoever. So all we have is each of their respective opinions. All right. Joe thinks punching was okay. Steve thinks punching was not okay. That's it. There's no way to resolve that dispute between them. Because all morality is the subjective opinions of all these different people. In other words, the truth of morality lies in the subject. The subject are the people, the individuals involved in the transaction. All right. So if morality is defined by the object, the act itself, it's objective. It's defined by the people, the subjects, it's subjective. All right. Now, obviously, if the truth of morality is that it's all just subjective, there is no law above us, or it's all just a matter of our personal opinions or our cultural impositions or whatever it may be, we don't need God, do we? We don't need God to explain that. All we need are the minds of all these individual people and what their opinions are. All right. So if morality is subjective, then there is no need for God to explain it. However, if it's not, if morality is objective and there is this objective moral law above us that we're all subject to whether we want to agree to it or not, then according to the moral argument, we do need God. All right. If morality is objective, in other words, if there is something more, if there's something above us that we're all subject to morally, then there needs to be a source that is above us that we're all subject to, whether we agree to it or not, that can be the source for that morality, and that's God. All right? Now, there are all sorts of problems with morality being subjective. We're not going to get into those right now, but that's kind of the next piece of the puzzle, all right? I've basically laid out the situation where if morality is subjective, you don't need God. If it's objective, you do. And so the next steps that I need to defend are, number one, that morality is not subjective, right? That morality is, in fact, objective, and that's one of the premises of our argument. And the other thing that I need to defend, then, is that there's no other potential source for an objective standard other than God. I think I've shown in this episode how God could be that source, all right? Through his character, through the fact that he's a person. All right, I do believe that Christianity does provide a viable answer to that question of if morality is objective, where does it come from? Yes, it's perfectly consistent. It could come from God. The question is, has anybody else been able to come up with any other possible explanations for an object of morality? Sam Harris is one who's tried, for example, and we'll get to all that, all right? But right now what I want to do is I kind of want to close today, or my portion of it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the live chat. Any comments, I'll be happy to answer them. If not, we'll just close after this. I want to close with a quote from C.S. Lewis, and I apologize I don't have a slide for this one. It's a pretty long quote anyway, so I'm just going to read it to you and ask you to listen to it. And it kind of shows where he was coming from. For those of you who don't know, C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, Mere Christianity, he was an atheist, and he eventually came around and obviously became a leading Christian apologist, one of the leading Christian voices of the 20th century. And what he does in this quote is he kind of explains what his thinking was when he was an atheist and what his leading objection was to Christianity, and how he came to realize through this moral argument that his objection didn't hold up. Here's his quote. Here's what he says. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such a violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. If the whole universe had no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never have known it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. that's the point of the moral argument, is that a lot of people, and we might get into this in more detail later, but a lot of people object to God because of all the evil they see in the world. And I think we will probably spend a whole episode talking about this down the line. People object to God because of all the evil they see in the world. But the problem is, the moment you say something is evil, you're assuming, and really evil, not just my personal opinion that it's evil, but it's really evil. You're assuming that there is that transcendent, that objective moral reality above us, whether we agree with it or not, that would define that thing as evil. But in order for that to be true, as we've shown through the moral argument, or started to show today, God has to exist. So you're saying something, you're objecting to God because of all the evil in the world, but in even making the objection, you first have to assume that God is real. It ends up being self-contradictory. We'll explore that more down the line, but that's kind of what C.S. Lewis is getting at, and that's one of the many powerful things about this moral argument. Don't see any questions in the live chat, so great. If you do have anything afterwards, put them in the comments section, or join us next episode, and I will try to answer them then. I do want to say that normally this is showing on Fridays at 12 noon. Like I said, you can watch it after the fact as well. It's still going to be up there on the YouTube channel. However, 1 week from today is Good Friday. And I'm thinking that we're not going to have an episode of this show on that day. Number one, it's Good Friday. We're going to have a Good Friday service on the channel here. So there is going to be something else live streaming on that day. So you're not left completely with anything. Plus, I imagine Randy Gass is probably still going to be doing his devotion in the morning. But also, to be honest, I'm about to get a whole lot busier. And not just because of Holy Week, although it's, I don't know if that's ready. I'm the one to disclose why yet, but this coming week is going to be extremely busy for me. So I don't think I'm going to have time necessarily to come on Friday at noon and do another episode. So let's plan on 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks from, I don't know what today is. Today is what, Friday, April 3rd. So we're looking at the 17th. Right? Yeah, doing my math right. Friday, April 17th will be our next episode of Pocket Size Apologetics. Please try to join us here at 12 noon if you're able. If not, like I said, feel free to watch it after the fact. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you all for watching, and God bless.